3 years in this tiny cell have given me a lot to think about. My name is Sophia, and this is the story of how I ended up here. People say marriage is a partnership, a bond built on trust and love. But what happens when one side forgets their vows? For me, it started as a quiet ache, a nagging sense of emptiness. James was my husband. He was charming, successful, and the man I once loved with all my being. The man I strongly believed I would share eternity with. But somewhere along the way, it was all a dream. In the beginning, I told myself it was normal. Everyone gets busy. His company was growing, and his late nights at the office were just the price of success. Or so I thought. But then the emotional distance became too much to ignore. I would sit across from him at dinner, pouring my heart into conversations he barely acknowledged. "I'm tired, Sophia," he'd say, brushing off my attempts to connect. I tried to stay strong, to hold on to the love we once had. But the cracks in our marriage grew deeper. One evening, I found myself scrolling through our shared bank account. James was always secretive about money, and I had learned not to ask too many questions. But something caught my eye, a large transfer to an account I didn't recognize. My heart raced. At first, I thought it might be a business expense, but the amounts kept appearing, always to the same account. A pit formed in my stomach. I couldn't let it go. I hired a private investigator. It felt extreme, but my instincts wouldn't let me rest. A week later, I received the report. James had a mistress. Her name was Emily. She was young, beautiful, and everything I wasn't anymore. The pain was unbearable. I confronted him that night. "How long has this been going on?" I demanded, holding the report in my trembling hands. James didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he looked at me with cold indifference. "It's not what you think," he said, as if that would make it better. I felt something inside me break. All those years of loyalty, of loving him through his flaws, had been for nothing. He didn't even care enough to apologize. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, a dangerous thought entered my mind. If he could betray me so easily, why should I protect him? I decided then and there that I would take everything from him, just as he had taken everything from me. The next morning, I began to put my plan into motion. I studied his habits, his weaknesses, and most importantly, his finances. James had built his company from the ground up, but he had always been careless with the details. He trusted me enough to leave certain passwords lying around. He underestimated me, and now that would be his downfall. By the time I was done, I had destroyed everything James had built, and I didn't feel an ounce of remorse. Getting access to the accounts was easier than I thought. James trusted me enough to leave certain passwords lying around. He always underestimated me, and now that would be his downfall. I spent weeks studying his finances, learning about the shares he held in his company, and figuring out how to transfer them without raising suspicion. My hands trembled the first time I logged into his account. The numbers were staggering. I'd never truly grasped how much he was worth. It made me angry all over again. While I was clipping coupons and worrying about groceries, he was funneling money to a mistress. How could someone live with such hypocrisy? I transferred a small amount to an offshore account, testing the waters. When nothing happened, I grew bolder. Each transfer was a storm of emotions. At times, I felt exhilaration coursing through me, a rare, twisted sense of power. Other times, guilt gnawed at me. My hands would shake as I stared at the screen, second-guessing every click. Was I doing this for justice or vengeance? Was there even a difference anymore? I shoved those thoughts aside, convincing myself that James deserved every bit of what I was doing. I started selling shares, carefully and methodically. With every sale, I imagined the cracks forming in his carefully curated empire. The money flowed into accounts he couldn't trace, accounts I'd created in secret. Every transaction felt like a victory, a way to reclaim the power he'd stolen from me. But it wasn't enough. I wanted him to feel the weight of betrayal, to taste the humiliation I had endured. So I started draining our personal accounts too. I left just enough to keep up appearances, but the rest vanished. I covered my tracks meticulously, ensuring there were no loose ends. All the while, I played the role of the loving wife, smiling at him over dinner, asking about his day as if nothing had changed. There were moments I caught him looking at me, perhaps sensing the shift in me. But he said nothing, too absorbed in his world to notice the danger lurking in his own home. It was almost laughable. The final blow came on a Thursday morning. James had an important meeting with investors, a presentation that would secure the future of his company. I waited until he left the house before making the transfer that would seal his fate. It was the culmination of weeks of planning. By the time he realized what had happened, it would be too late. Or so I thought. That evening, as I sat alone in the living room, the sound of sirens shattered the silence. My heart stopped. The police were at my door. My chest tightened as they placed me in handcuffs. "You're under arrest for embezzlement and fraud," one of them said. Their words echoed in my ears, but my body felt numb. I didn't resist. There was no point. As they led me away, I caught a glimpse of James standing in the doorway. For the first time in years, he looked at me. Really looked at me. His expression wasn't anger or betrayal. It was something else. Regret. Prison changes you. It strips you down to your core, forcing you to confront the person you've become. For me, those first few months were the hardest. I replayed every decision I'd made, every step that had led me here. At first, I told myself I'd done the right thing. James deserved it. But as the days turned into weeks, doubt began to creep in. I received a letter from him about 6 months into my sentence. It was short, almost cold, but it stayed with me. "I'm sorry," it read, "for everything." That was it. No explanations, no excuses. Just an apology. I didn't know what to make of it. Over time, I learned more about myself than I ever wanted to. The anger I'd carried for so long, the bitterness that had consumed me. It wasn't just about James. It was about me too. I'd let myself become invisible, waiting for someone else to validate my worth. And when that didn't happen, I'd lashed out in the most destructive way possible. James never visited me, but I heard from mutual friends that he'd changed. They told me he had sold what was left of the company and moved into a modest house on the outskirts of town. He started volunteering at shelters, helping those in need, something I never imagined him doing in the years we were together. At first, I felt nothing but anger. How dare he find redemption while I languished here? But as the days passed, curiosity crept in. Was this the same man who once ignored my tears, who cared more for his mistress than his own wife? The image of him working selflessly for others haunted me. Did he regret what he had done, or was this change only a mask? I wrestled with these questions endlessly, my emotions swinging between bitterness and a strange sense of hope. Could it be that the man I had loved, the man I had tried to destroy, had finally found his humanity? The thought lingered as I reflected on the choices I had made. I had stripped him of his company, his wealth, and his pride. But in doing so, I had also stripped myself of my own dignity. During my time here, I began attending counseling sessions. For the first time in years, I confronted the wounds I had carried long before James came into my life. Abandonment, loneliness, the fear of not being enough. I started to see how those feelings had shaped my actions, how I had placed all my worth in someone else's hands, only to feel shattered when they failed me. James's changes, though painful to accept, began to soften something inside me. He had sold what was left of the company and moved to a smaller house. He started volunteering, something I'd never imagined him doing. Part of me hated him for being able to rebuild his life while I was stuck here. But another part of me ached for him. Despite everything, I still loved him. As my release date approached, I found myself asking the same question over and over. If I could go back, would I do it all again? The answer wasn't as simple as I'd hoped. Yes, James had hurt me. But in trying to hurt him back, I'd destroyed myself. Was it worth it? Or had I just perpetuated the cycle of pain? Now, as I sit here, counting down the days until I'm free, I wonder what the future holds. Will James forgive me? Will I forgive myself? Most importantly, how do you rebuild a life from the ashes of betrayal? The answer is one I may never know. I recall my last conversation with my cellmate before she was released. "Do you think redemption is ever enough?" she'd asked, her eyes heavy with regret. It's a question that needs an answer, one that I've turned over in my mind countless times. Is redemption enough to erase the pain we've caused? Or does the weight of our actions linger forever? As I sit here, looking out through the tiny window at the world beyond, I realize that maybe it's not about erasing the past, but learning to live with it. Perhaps true redemption lies in the willingness to confront our mistakes and the courage to try again, no matter how daunting the road ahead may seem. When I leave this place, I won't be the same woman who walked in 3 years ago. The question remains, will the world, and James, see the person I've become? Or will they only remember the one I used to be? Does redemption mean anything if no one is left to see it? If you enjoyed this video, kindly ensure to like and subscribe to English Night Tales for more interesting content. Thank you.